Practical application. Summon wisdom to deal with suffering. In the development of happiness, it is important not to neglect the term dukkha, suffering. An acknowledgement is made that suffering exists, and that it is both placed in opposition to and paired alongside happiness. People need to gain a comprehensive and clear perspective of these matters, rather than practice avoidance and leave unresolved issues to fester in the mind. Moreover, if one is happy yet suffering still exists, then that happiness is not true and reliable. Therefore, the development of happiness implies the simultaneous reduction, removal, disappearance, and the cessation of suffering. The expression development of happiness can thus be replaced with the expression cessation of suffering. These refer to one and the same process, and for this process to be complete, regardless of how much happiness a person may experience, one must reach the stage of the utter cessation of suffering. Technically speaking, to counter the sense that the development of happiness is open-ended and without a clear end goal, it is referred to as the cessation of suffering. The term cessation, which is a translation for the Pali term nirodha, carries with it specific linguistic problems, in that its meaning is not altogether clear and it may give rise to misunderstanding. When people hear the phrase cessation of suffering, they may understand that this refers to a gradual yet constant elimination or removal of suffering existing in the heart. In fact, the true meaning of nirodha refers to the non-arising of suffering, or to the complete and utter freedom from suffering. On the highest level, nirodha refers to nibbana, a state completely free from suffering. Occasionally, the term anupada nirodha is used, translated as cessation by means of non-arising, that is, absolute or complete cessation. For the sake of convenience, we may thus translate dukkha nirodha as the non-arising of suffering, or freedom from suffering. Partly for ease of mind of the listeners when this subject is discussed, the term suffering is often avoided, and instead the process is described as the development of happiness. Note, however, that by doing so one is not neglecting the subject of suffering, and eventually one will need to address it accordingly. The expression development of happiness necessarily implies the proper management of suffering. An essential aspect of suffering is one's attitude and relationship to it. If one fails to understand the importance of this point, then one will be unable to truly develop in happiness. Here we are referring to the duty or responsibility, kiccha, wish, suffering. If one gets this wrong, then one's entire spiritual practice will be misdirected and end in failure. People often neglect this essential factor. As suffering is the first noble truth, let us review the duties and responsibilities pertaining to all four of the noble truths. 1. Suffering, dukkha, the state of pressure and affliction, which generates problems for people. Alternatively, anything that has the capacity to create problems. The associated responsibility here is parinya, thorough or comprehensive understanding. 2. Cause of suffering, samudaya. The associated responsibility is pahana, abandoning, eliminating, or ending. 3. Cessation of suffering, nirodha. The associated responsibility is satyakriya, realizing, seeing clearly, actualizing, or attaining. 4. Path, magga. The way leading to the end of suffering. The associated responsibility is bhavana, cultivating, developing, practicing, or undertaking. Without going into a lengthy analysis of these 4 responsibilities here, note, however, that they are of fundamental importance. They exist inextricably paired with the Four Noble Truths. For if one practices any one of the Four Noble Truths incorrectly, in respect to its associated duty or responsibility, one's progress in the Dhamma will come to naught, and one's efforts will be in vain. It will be impossible to awaken or to realize the Dhamma. In respect to the First Noble Truth, the Pali states, with suffering there should be thorough understanding, dukkhaṃ pariññāyaṃ. Suffering must be understood by way of wisdom. Suffering is there to be understood. A simple example of this is that before one is able to solve a problem, one must first understand the nature of the problem. The definition of dukkha is not limited to the general concept of physical and mental pain and discomfort. The term also refers to everything that has the potential to create a sense of oppression when one fails to respond to it correctly. For this reason, the subject of suffering requires comprehensive understanding. In sum, suffering is a matter to be taken up and dealt with by wisdom. It is not something to be stored up and accumulated in the heart until it oozes out or goes rancid, and one loses one's radiance and joy. If one encounters suffering, welcome it with wisdom. Don't allow the mind to get caught up with it, or as people informally say, don't obsess over your emotions. Don't burden or oppress the mind with suffering. And if the mind has already allowed it entry, don't let it smoulder. Hasten to send it on to wisdom. If one simply stores up suffering within the heart, one suffers in vain. One does not dispel it, and one's life becomes stuck. Yet if one allows wisdom to deal with it, besides finding solutions to end it, one's whole life moves forward. It is not the mind's responsibility to deal with suffering. This responsibility rests with wisdom. The mind's task is not to bear suffering, but rather to apply wisdom. The principal agent in this matter is wisdom, which solves problems and dispels suffering. Wisdom brings suffering to an end, and at the same time generates happiness. The mind's responsibility is to witness happiness. One should develop the mind's proficiency for experiencing happiness, and develop wisdom's ability to solve problems and dispel suffering. A healthy mind is endowed with happiness, and healthy wisdom is capable of dispelling suffering. For the mind to be truly healthy and happy, wisdom must completely dispel suffering. Spiritual practice needs to be accurate by attending to the duty corresponding to each of the Four Noble Truths. If one oppresses oneself by accumulating suffering, causing internal distress, frustration, and depression, one is responding to suffering incorrectly. Instead, one needs to change course and summon wisdom to help. Happiness is classified as part of the Third Noble Truth, cessation nirodha. It is recognized that there are relative degrees of happiness which need to be developed until one reaches supreme happiness. The responsibility here is Satchikiriya, to realize, actualize our perfect happiness. The development of happiness should be attended to as a regular and constant part of one's life. The ability to be happy is the starting point of spiritual practice. For this reason, one needs to establish oneself correctly from the outset, so that one goes in the right direction and proceeds with confidence.